So trauma happens whenever the energy that was summoned to respond to a threat doesn't get released, doesn't get discharged. So in the wild, we are humans, we are human animals. And in the wild, what has happened for thousands and thousands of years is, and what still happens to animals, is when an animal perceives a threat, it will do what's called an oriented response. So basically, think about an antelope perceives a rustling in the bushes, and it will turn its ears and turn the face and the body towards where the possible threat may be, seeking for what is it that's making that sound and where is it exactly. As it's doing that, the system of the animal, and the system also of humans does this as well. The system of the animal begins summoning energy to respond to a possible threat. If the threat becomes real, like a lion pops out of the bush and starts running towards the antelope, the system of the animal has to make a choice between fighting or fleeing and running away. If it's an antelope, the chances to survive and to fight against a lion are none. And so the antelope is going to run, so it's going to summon an enormous amount of energy to outrun the lion and just run away. As humans, we do this too. If we feel threatened, our instinctual response is to either like turn and fight towards the threat or run. If our systems realize that we can't do that because it's too late, because we're trapped for whatever reason, our system realizes that we can't win or we can't run away, then it will opt for a third option, which is the freeze response, the immobility response. The classic deer in the headlights, and the system will shut down and play dead, basically. Because in the wild, that particular response could actually save the life of the animal. And so this happens to us as well. If we survive the threat, and when we survive the threat, then what our bodies naturally tend to want to do is discharge the energy that was summoned, frozen, and locked inside the body. And then when we come out of the freeze, we're basically thawing, and the body wants to naturally discharge that enormous energy. So what usually that looks like is shaking and quivering, shaking and releasing that energy. For us humans, often for us civilized humans, this process doesn't naturally happen because we are often afraid of the enormous sensation, the overwhelming often sensations and the overwhelming feelings that were trapped inside our bodies that originally were rightfully enormous because they needed to respond to a possible life-threatening threat, danger. And so as we thaw from that freeze and we begin re-experiencing the enormous terror, that enormous rage, we're often afraid of what comes up. And so we put a lid on it and we shut down our sensations and whatever it's emerging. The reason it's emerging is, again, so that the body can reintegrate and come back to a dynamic equilibrium. Energy is summoned, we freeze, and then what would naturally happen is the energy is summoned, we freeze, and then the energy would need to be released to come back to balance, but we don't release it, and therefore it creates a self-perpetuating cycle of constantly feeling threatened because the body since it hasn't released the energy, did not get the message that the threat is gone. So it's a constant, often hypervigilance of feeling the threat everywhere. and so summoning even more energy, and then the system feeling overwhelmed by the amount of energy, and so shutting down into freeze again, into immobility. And so it's a constant cycle until the energy gets released. We can't come back to full balance. It's my theory and my guess that the majority of us humans, 7 billion people, has experienced trauma and shock at least once in their life. Most of us are traumatized and have been subject to trauma and shock. Then we are walking around with systems, nervous systems, that are constantly aroused. They're constantly aroused, and the arousal is the arousal of the energy in response to the threat. But since we didn't discharge, we are constantly subtly bubbling with arousal. It's constantly there. Peter Levine says that the traumatic coupling happens when one stimulus is related and connected to a particular response. So think about if people are walking around with this frozen, aroused energy in their bodies all the time, then okay, so think about for a moment, if I'm walking around with undischarged, aroused energy in my body all the time, and think about, imagine this glass of water being, the glass being my body, and then the water, the murky water, being the undischarged, aroused energy. So that means I'm in a constant state of subtle arousal. Whatever I'm doing, I'm in a constant state of subtle arousal. It won't take long for me to get to a tipping point and experience feelings of enormous terror or enormous rage. So if I then am at a bar or at a pub and I am meeting people, and then I get physically intimate with someone, and we're touching and kissing, etc. And so sexual arousal begins stimulating me. This is the sexual arousal. Then it won't take long until this is what happens. Basically, the pure energy of maybe excitement and sensual pleasure that I was feeling initially, that I would have felt if my container was completely empty, now gets mixed up with the murky water. It gets mixed up with that undischarged, very powerful aroused energy that was already in my body. Therefore, I will be quickly rising and experiencing possibly rage and possibly terror, enormous fear, helplessness. Now, this doesn't maybe necessarily happen, or it doesn't seem like it happened in everyday encounters. However, something that I noticed with myself a few years ago was that whenever I would be spending time with a friend, and eventually we would get physically intimate, not necessarily sexual, just physical intimacy or physical touch, and there would be hugs and maybe some caressing, I would notice that my system would quickly kick into sexual arousal. And I noticed that it started to happen pretty consistently. And so I began getting suspicious, because how come that a simple stroking or a simple hug or a simple intimate physical time with someone would immediately kick me up to sexual arousal, and then wanting to have sex with that person, feeling this enormous impulse to have sex with the person. And so what could happen, I think, what may be happening is traumatic coupling, is that there's already undischarged energy in my system. There's already there's already aroused undischarged energy in my system. And then if I'm adding something simple as sensual pleasure, doesn't necessarily have to be sexual or the desire to have sex with someone, but simple enjoyment of physical bodily touch, that's added to the other energy, and my system then gets really confused. The system can't recognize what is what. It may be interpreting the feelings of pleasure with possibly feelings of enormous fear. All of a sudden, I'm about to get sexual with someone, or I'm about to become intimate with them, and all of a sudden I'm enormously scared, and all these emotion and sensation arise. The trick with humans is that we often being afraid of our sensations and emotions, we often put a lid on that as well. Especially as we are about to be sexual with someone, or to be intimate with someone. So we already have undischarged energy, we add the sensual pleasure that rises up, and maybe we begin feeling uncomfortable, or we begin feeling slightly confused. We don't know what is what. We don't know if our feelings of arousal are actually feelings of arousal. We can't fully distinguish that from fear, and often we have sex from that place, from that confused place, by not being fully in touch with our bodies. So that to me is incredibly scary, because we are having sex and we are connecting with each other in a very intimate way from a place of wounding and from a place of often confusion, because we're not taught to be in contact with our felt sense, with our sensations, with our emotions, and so it's very difficult to know what kind of arousal it's happening in our body. And we're not taught about trauma. We're not taught about discharging energy and come back to balance, so that our glass, by discharging the energy, can come back to clean or something. Many of us are dissociated beings that long for intimacy and long for fullness and long for the experience of ecstasy that the sex will provide, and that will eventually, through experiencing ecstasy, the unconscious hope that it will bring us back to our own fullness, my own fullness. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen, because the container hasn't been emptied. The container hasn't been discharged of that initial aroused energy. And for me, what's even more troubling is that we are creating babies. We are creating new life forms, new human beings, with this murky, mixed energy. And so we're creating babies that are being born in a traumatized environment. And that to me is really sad and scary. He talks about the felt sense, a term that he borrowed from Gendling. And the felt sense is simply going within. It's what I called inscendence in another video. It's a term by Thomas Berry, inscendence. It's going within and really being aware of the ecology of the body, being aware of sensation in my body, beatings and moving energies, and then eventually being aware of sensation, being aware of emotions, and begin to find places of safety in my own body, places where I can find comfort and safety. It may be even just my feet or my toes. And bringing that comforting energy to the parts of my body that feel numb or dissociated or traumatized or scared or rageful. And through that beginning renegotiating, and Peter Levine calls it titrating. What that means, through the felt sense, beginning to enter into those parts that are very highly aroused and very highly charged with terror or with rage. And these are emotional connotation to simple sensations. Simple sensation that often feel overwhelming to a traumatized person. And so he calls it titrating. It means gently just touching those, getting in contact with those sensations that have been and are overwhelming. And then stepping back and going back to my feet, going back to feeling my feet, feeling my breath coming in, going back to feeling something that feels comfortable in the body. And it will be different for each person, or similar even for each person. And by doing this, by going in and touching and coming back, I am building a stronger container, a stronger container as in my body. My body is becoming more and more used to handling more intense energy, more overwhelming energy. And eventually, what happens is that I'm able to renegotiate the trauma. I'm able to oscillate between what was overwhelming and what is comfortable, and eventually bring the system back to center and back to balance, back to dynamic balance, dynamic equilibrium. So there's many different techniques. However, to me, the underlying spirit is to really begin to solve and unwind the frozen trauma in our bodies, so that we can live full lives clear of any past residual energy, and we can come back to fullness and be full and whole human beings again.